They would tell health workers, they would tell members of crisis teams, they would even sometimes directly go up to the police and tell the police, this is what's happening to me, I need help. And in almost all of those cases, or the vast majority of those cases, every level of institute failed them. Every level. And it failed them because ultimately, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I'm going to be talking about something that has been in the news recently. Elon Musk has talked about it on Twitter. It has been the dark history of England for the last few decades when it comes to the grooming gangs. Now, for the last few decades, it has been revealed, it has come to light that there have been organized groups of men who have actively sought out young underage girls, particularly girls who are native to England, and groomed them to ultimately use them for sex, and they would force these activities onto these girls. And either way, it's irrelevant because a child cannot consent. There's no meaningful way in which a child can consent, and any form of child sexual activity is rape by definition. I'll make that absolutely clear. These organized groups were doing this for decades, at least going back to the early 2000s, but I think it precedes that. And it was being done in a systematic, high-level way that managed to avoid pretty much any police investigation for multiple decades, even with consistent pleading, begging from family members to try to get the police to act on this. There are actually accounts of fathers, mothers, uncles, brothers, whoever, going to the police and telling them that their daughter, their sister, is actively being taken advantage of and being sexually assaulted by multiple people, and she's underage, she's 12, 13, 14, 15, something like that, and the police went, nope, we're not going to pursue it. There's not enough evidence. Not going to do anything about it. And what's truly tragic is the level of abuse that was taking place to these girls throughout the last 2 or 3 decades. But not only that, it's the response or lack of response by not just the police across multiple different counties, because this issue didn't just take place in an isolated part of England. It took place in many different areas in England simultaneously, by different gangs that all were doing the same idea, the same thing. They were grooming young children, girls, who were mostly native English, and they were getting them to do a combination of running drugs for them, but also they were sexually abusing them and entering into sexual relationships with children, and children cannot consent. Now, that in and of itself is horrifying. That in and of itself is terrible, it's evil, it's something that should be called out. But here's where it gets political. You may think, well, how is it possible that all this was going on and the police just didn't investigate, didn't take people to court, and it just stagnated? No one did anything about it. That's because there were reasons as to why it would be better for the different institutes to look the other direction, to look away. That's because the perpetrators of these horrific crimes across all the different counties in England, so miles and miles apart from each other, were overwhelmingly from minority ethnic backgrounds, predominantly Pakistani. And this led to difficulties in wanting to fully pursue these kind of criminal cases, even though we know they were aware of them going back to at least early 2000s. So why didn't the police want to prosecute them? Why didn't the police investigate, launch some kind of investigation into these organized crime units? This isn't just odd individuals, it's actually a part of organized crime. In one of the reports I read, they actually named the people they believed, it was redacted, but they named the people who they knew were at the top of this organized crime unit, and they've been doing this for years and had a systematic way of doing it. They would groom children, offer them food. Food seems to be one of the main things, from kebab shops that they owned. Not only does this come from a minority ethnic community, but it comes from a minority ethnic community in England that owns takeaway shops, kebab shops, that would offer them food and money and gifts and alcohol and drugs in exchange for sex. And they would groom them into this process over a period of time until they basically have the person either dependent on drugs like alcohol or heroin or cocaine or some form of that, or they were so beaten down physically and mentally that there would be no resistance to them. They would isolate them from their family. They would prey particularly on people who had no close family or were distant from their family or didn't have the strongest bonds with their family, especially kids that were living in hostels, that were living in social care. They had to rely on support of the councils because the councils, they knew, did a terrible job at looking after these kids. So they preyed on these children to get them into this situation where they can sexually abuse them in the most horrific and horrendous ways possible for multiple years, completely undetected, and it's tragic. And what's so horrifying, the thing that will get to you more than anything else about what I've said so far, is the fact that these girls weren't silent. You might think, oh, well, they never said anything, so how were the police to know? No. These girls frequently talked about their abuse. They would describe what they went through. They would talk about who did it. They would frequently describe the men as Asian. They would call them their boyfriends because that's what they believed they were. These girls are so young, they're children, they have no understanding of the actual adult world. And of course, they've been deceived and groomed into believing this. They would tell health workers, they would tell members of crisis teams, they would even sometimes directly go up to the police and tell the police, this is what's happening to me, I need help. And in almost all of those cases, or the vast majority of those cases, every level of institute failed them. Every level. And it failed them because ultimately the only way this would ever be resolved is if the police would take action, find the men who were doing this, place charges, arrest them, take them off the streets, and deal with the actual issue. But the police never did this. And when you look at the reports, and just so you guys know, in 2004 there was a report, there was an operation, I think it's like Operation Augusta. Let me check that. Yeah, look at this. I'm reading this here from the Greater Manchester website, and I'm going to focus on Greater Manchester for this because it's in Rochdale in particular, because it's so bad, and there has been multiple reports and multiple operations trying to solve this, and every single report points out the same failures, and yet the police force and other institutions don't do anything about it apparently. But let's read this, and you can see what I mean. The report, written by Child Protection Specialist Malcolm Newsome, CBE, and a former senior police officer, Gary Ridgway, considers the Operation Augusta investigation, which was launched by Greater Manchester Police following the death of 15-year-old Victoria Agolia, who, after years of abuse and days after she was injected with heroin by a 50-year-old man, died in hospital of an overdose in 2003. Whilst the report states there is much to be commended in Operation Augusta, it found that it had not addressed the issue it was set up for, to tackle the sexual exploitation of a number of children in the care system. Very few of the relevant perpetrators were brought to justice, and neither were their activities disrupted. Although there were 8 criminal justice outcomes in total, 7 were prosecutions related to police investigations and 1 was an immigration outcome. So in 2004, based off an absolutely horrendous case of a young girl being ultimately sexually abused and killed by an intentional drug overdose of heroin by the 50-year-old man who was abusing her, they launched this investigation called Operation Augusta. They were going to investigate Greater Manchester Police to figure out exactly what they could have done differently to not have that happen and to avoid that ever happening again. The report highlighted multiple different styles of failings, one of which was the fact that there are statutory decisions that can be made as part of the police force based on evidences that are not just witness testimony. You can look, for example, for signs of physical abuse, signs of sexual assault, signs of drug use, coercion, so on and so forth, and they can make cases and press charges based off that kind of evidence. For whatever reason, Greater Manchester Police decided not to pursue those kinds of lines of inquiry and instead rationalised this idea that because these girls who were under the age of 16, 12, 13, 14, 15, because they weren't willing to make a formal complaint and instead would only tell them in a casual sense, this is what's happening to me, this is what I am doing with these men who are adults and I am a child. They were being honest about every issue, every horrible thing that was happening to them in their lives. The police would not take it further because the children were not willing to file a formal complaint and to press charges. And that was seen as the number one reason why the police refused to act. Now, I don't think that that's the main reason. I think that you would have to be next level stupid. And just to keep this in mind here, what they are trying to tell you is they would use alternative language to describe the topics that are being discussed, right? Because you can't just have a child tell you that in effect they've been raped multiple times and it's ongoing, and then just let the child walk away and be like, oh, good luck. You're not supposed to be able to do that. The way that the Greater Manchester Police and other police forces and other institutions across England in multiple different counties, the way they rationalised it was that these are not children. Doesn't matter if they're 12, 13, 14, 15. They're not actually children. They're young adults who have made a lifestyle choice. They have chosen to go out drink alcohol, do drugs, sleep with multiple predominantly Asian men, continue in often violent relationships with them, take heroin, cocaine, whatever it might be. And this was their choice. It was something they willingly engaged in. They weighed the pros and cons. They made a rational decision that this is what they wanted to do. And so it's just a lifestyle choice. I'm not going to lie. That's so evil. That's so just thinking about that. The idea that there are people, and I really want to stress this, there would have been meetings in multiple institutions, whether it's crisis teams, whether it's social care, whether it's police forces. There would have been meetings where they discuss cases of known girls who have told them personally that they are going through this stuff. And they would have had to have made decisions based off that information. And they would have had meetings at tables. They would have had an agenda, and they would have had minutes, and they would have recorded what was said. In fact, we know this because it's in reports. And they came to the same stupid and bizarre conclusions that there isn't enough evidence because they won't make a formal complaint. It's not our responsibility. It's a different institution's responsibility. We forward it on to them. They'll deal with it. We're not going to actually make any decisions this meeting. We're going to forward it on to someone else who will hopefully make a decision with some other group at some other time, but we won't chase it up. We can't do anything if these girls are willingly doing this. And my absolute favourite, yes, we did have a meeting to discuss this 12-year-old girl that came up to us and told us she was being repeatedly raped, but we lost the minutes. So we have no idea what was said in that meeting, and funny enough, none of us remember. For anyone who's ever been in a meeting, like if you do this for work, for example, you will know that there are productive meetings and there are non-productive meetings. And non-productive meetings tend to use the same techniques to make it look like there's been some kind of actionable checklist of things to do after the meeting that have been talked about in the meeting that we have agreed we will go and do this, and then you go and do it, and that's a productive meeting. But there's also certain things that non-productive meetings do, which are telltale signs that people are intentionally not wanting to make a decision. And this tends to be things like, we will take it offline and we'll circle back and discuss it at another time. Certain people were missing and hence we couldn't come up to a decision, so we've rearranged it for another time. There was confusion over whose responsibility this was, and so there needs to be a meeting to sort that out before we can have this meeting. Funny enough, that meeting never happens, and so on and so forth. These are telltale signs of people who are trying not to solve an issue. They're just pushing it away because there is some reason they might have for not engaging in this. And I think it's very clear, which the reports also say, that this is probably because it's racially motivated. The people who perpetrate these crimes, who are part of organized crime gangs across the country, are of an ethnic minority. They are Pakistani majority, and they don't want people to be aware of this. Let me just quote to you something that Elon tweeted, and I think this kind of sums up the thinking that people had in England when this was going on and how they chose to address it. In Rotherham, a senior police officer told a distressed father that the town would erupt if the routine abuse of white children by Pakistani heritage men became public knowledge. So again, they knew about this. It wasn't as if this was just something they hadn't figured out. They were all aware that for some reason these guys are from a particular minority group. This was clearly a case of in-group, out-group bias, where an ethnic minority had for whatever reason decided that their in-group was predominantly Pakistani men and their out-group was predominantly native white English girls who were underage, who they're specifically grooming and specifically targeting. One parent concerned about a missing daughter was told by the police that an older Asian boyfriend was a fashion accessory for girls in the town. Notice again this whole idea that these aren't girls, these aren't children in the eyes of the police, these are young adults who are making an informed decision to live a lifestyle choice. Man, that makes me want to vomit even saying that. That's absolutely disgusting. The father of a 15-year-old rape victim was told the assault might mean she would learn her lesson. Yes, the old, it must be their fault. They did something wrong. They were hanging around the wrong people, so they are the ones to blame. If only they had done things differently, then these predominantly ethnic minority Pakistani men would not have chosen to sexually abuse them. Blaming the victim 101. And it's a child, by the way. It's a child victim that is being blamed for what happened to them. The very lowest depths of evil there. The very lowest depths. Before I end this video, because I honestly cannot keep reading about this because it is actually too upsetting. It actually is. It's very difficult to record this video, but I'm going to try and power through this before I end. There is a ton of things that you can read further about this that will give you more details. There are a lot of high-profile cases of particular girls who were killed tragically, And the more you read about them, the more it will make your heart break, particularly when you see how they were treated by social care, by the police, just multiple institutions, by local councils, how they all failed to appropriately give these girls the help and the protection they needed. But let's look at this before I go. This is the review for what is basically... let me read this. So first of all, independent assurance review of the effectiveness of multi-agency responses to child sexual exploitation in Greater Manchester. Part 3. The review into Operation Span. Operation Span is a particular operation that was launched in response to these events coming to light, and certain independent bodies wanted to evaluate the Greater Manchester Police's effectiveness in dealing with these issues. Let's see what they have to say about this. So I want to point out here's the contents page. It talks about Operation Span, which is what this is covering, this report and its conclusions. What's really interesting as well is there's another operation, Operation Doublet, which also tried to find very similar things that this operation found. You see here, chapter 12, the allegation that the crisis intervention team failed to appropriately refer their concerns to the statutory agencies. To be fair, having read this, it seems as if actually the crisis teams are actually some of the best or the better institutions involved in this. They actually did seem to try and help people, as far as I can tell from my reading. But let's go to page 31. Right, let's just read this. In our first report on Operation Augusta, which was an earlier report done back in 2004, we looked at the severe exploitation and death of Victoria Agolia in 2003. In summary, in the 2 years before her death, while in the care of Manchester City Council, Victoria Agolia was repeatedly threatened, assaulted, returned intoxicated and in distress, gave information that she was involved in sexual exploitation, alleged rape, and sexual assault, requiring medical attention. Let that sink in for a second. She required medical attention from these sexual assaults. Became involved in the criminal justice system and had several pregnancy scars. She actually gave birth from this. In our report, we noted that there was evidence of some multi-agency meetings, but none of these occasions resulted in Section 47 child protection investigation to protect Victoria from significant harm. Regrettably, we have found that the lessons to be learned from the tragic death of Victoria Agolia in 2003 were not followed through by the actions of the Greater Manchester Police. We have found many examples in the case studies we considered of children who disclosed exploitation continuing not to be protected from significant harm, and the child's unwillingness to make a formal complaint being repeatedly used as an explanation for not pursuing these investigations and tackling their abusers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we refer to in England when we talk about the grooming gangs. These were brought to light actually by other prominent figures. Tommy Robinson was one person who was calling this out back in early 2010s. He wasn't really... Actually, I think it may have been before 2010. He wasn't taken seriously. A few years later, all of this came out to media attention and the whole world took it very, very seriously. Although there have been some convictions, some charges that actually were made and did stick and did result in people being trialed and found guilty, these were nowhere near the amount that people in these reports found. People in these reports highlighted tens, if not hundreds, of likely probable sexual exploiters of children, the overwhelming majority from Pakistani ethnic minority backgrounds. And you're talking of only a fraction of those ever faced any consequences for their actions, up until today. Even today, there just hasn't been any desire to invest significant amounts of resources and money into this. There just hasn't been. And the English people on a whole see this as being a case of putting political concerns, fears of being perceived as racist or somehow anti-ethnic minority or anti-multiculturalism as some sort of lofty idea where we sacrificed our children basically to those ideas, and we looked the other way. We told people that they were adults. We told people that they were adults making lifestyle decisions, and that's one of the black stains on our recent history. And it's something that is probably still ongoing. It's probably something that hasn't been addressed because there isn't at any political level any actual will to do that, because you're going to be looked at as being pretty racist for doing that, because unfortunately the majority of the people that were involved in these crimes happen to be from mostly a Pakistani background. To all the politicians, I hope it was worth it. I hope the commitment to multiculturalism and pluralism and tolerance at the ultimate extreme to tolerate anything was worth the lives of these children, both those that died and those who will never be able to deal with the horrific events that they were forced into, that they had no choice to, that they couldn't consent to, in their hundreds, thousands, the estimates are horrifying. There's some even estimates going up to 1 million children over these decades that have been exposed to this. I hope it was worth it. If you want to learn more about this, you can be prepared for some very difficult reading. I struggled immensely to read this. I've always known about this, as every person in England does know about this, but looking into it more, you need thick skin, because you'll get angry and you'll get upset. But anyway, God bless you all. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.